It was supposed to be a fun night. Just me, Rachel, and Emma having a sleepover. We'd been doing sleepovers for years, ever since we were kids, but this one felt different. My parents were gone for the weekend, so we had the whole house to ourselves, which meant staying up as late as we wanted and watching horror movies we'd probably regret later. Around midnight, we'd already been through 2 scary movies, and our nerves were pretty much shot. We decided to tell each other ghost stories just to keep the spooky vibe going. I think we were all trying to act tougher than we felt because every single noise made us jump. Every few minutes, one of us would glance at the windows, almost expecting to see something staring back at us. Eventually, we got hungry, so we headed to the kitchen for snacks. I remember we were laughing and joking around, but when we got to the kitchen, I noticed a notification on my phone. I'd installed a security camera in the backyard a while back, mainly because my parents insisted on it, and I hadn't really thought much of it until then. I figured maybe it was my cat or a squirrel or something. But when I opened the app, my heart stopped. The camera showed the backyard, and at first, it looked empty. Just the bushes moving in the wind, nothing unusual. But then, just at the edge of the camera's view, a shadow appeared, creeping toward the house. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I realized it was a person. "Hey, what's wrong?" Emma asked, noticing how tense I'd gotten. I handed her my phone, not taking my eyes off the screen. Rachel leaned in to look too, and none of us said a word as we watched the figure step out from behind the trees, moving closer to the house. He stopped near the bushes, and then he just stood there. I told myself it was probably some weirdo passing through. Maybe he was lost, or maybe it was some stupid prank. But then the person lifted their head, looking directly into the camera, as if he knew we were watching him. I couldn't see his whole face, but what I could see was terrifying. His face was pale, almost unnaturally white, like he was wearing makeup or something, and his eyes were completely blacked out. The worst part was his smile. It stretched way too wide, like someone had painted it on and kept going. It didn't look like a real smile at all. My phone slipped in my hand, and Rachel quickly shut it off, whispering, "Should we call the police?" Before I could answer, we heard a soft tapping sound coming from the window right next to us. All 3 of us just froze. The tapping got louder, like whoever was outside was running his fingers across the glass over and over. We were paralyzed, too scared to move or even breathe. I didn't want to look, but at the same time, I had to know if he was really out there. So, like an idiot, I slowly reached over and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. And that's when I saw him, just inches from my face. He was standing right there, his eyes staring straight at me through the glass. His face was pressed so close that his breath was fogging up the window. His wide, painted smile was stretched so unnaturally, like he was forcing his face to look happy, but his eyes were cold and empty. I let out this strangled scream, stumbling back so fast that I tripped over my own feet. Emma grabbed my arm, and all 3 of us bolted up the stairs, slamming my bedroom door and locking it. My hands were shaking as I called the police, barely able to get the words out. I just kept repeating that there was a man outside the house, tapping on our windows. They told us to stay in the room until officers arrived, so we huddled together, barely breathing, listening to every creak and groan in the house, terrified he'd find a way inside. When the police finally arrived, we heard them shouting outside, and only then did we unlock the door and go downstairs to meet them. They looked around the yard and found footprints leading right up to the kitchen window. The officer pointed out something I hadn't noticed, a smudge on the glass, like someone had dragged their fingers across it, leaving greasy streaks. They promised they'd patrol the area, but they never found him. A few days later, when I finally calmed down enough, I decided to check the footage again. I thought maybe it'd help me understand what happened, maybe even help me sleep again. I played the video from that night, Fast forwarding to the moment he showed up. Watching it again was almost worse than seeing it live. This time, I noticed things I hadn't before. The man didn't just stand at the kitchen window. He moved slowly around the house, looking into each window as if searching for us. He disappeared from the camera's view for a few minutes, then reappeared on the side of the house, right by the living room where we'd been earlier. And in one of the final frames, I saw him standing outside my bedroom window, the same window we'd been hiding behind upstairs, thinking we were safe. He must have been there, just inches away, as we whispered and tried not to breathe, too afraid he'd find us. But he already had. It was supposed to be a normal sleepover. Just me, Lily, Ava, and Mira, huddled in Lily's living room with bowls of popcorn and scary movies lined up for the night. Lily's parents were out for the evening, and they wouldn't be back until late, so we had the whole house to ourselves. We'd just finished the second movie, and it was a little after midnight. The movie had been about a home invasion, and we were all laughing about how ridiculous it was. None of us took it too seriously, even though I'll admit I was feeling a little jumpy. But, nothing ever actually happens. That's what we kept telling each other. Around 1 in the morning, we heard a noise from upstairs. It sounded like a door opening and closing. We all froze, listening. Lily's house had this old, creaky staircase, and when we heard soft footsteps moving slowly down the stairs, we exchanged nervous glances. But then we laughed, trying to brush it off. Probably just the house settling, Myra said with a shaky smile. But then the footsteps stopped and everything went silent. Ava pulled out her phone and with a hesitant laugh, suggested we check if Lily's parents had come home early. Lily shook her head. They would have told me if they were coming home. Plus, they'd call out when they came in. We waited, our eyes fixed on the stairwell that led into the living room. After a few long minutes of silence, we started to relax, telling ourselves it was just the house creaking after all. Then we heard something, a faint shuffling, like someone moving carefully, trying not to make a sound. The hair on my arms stood up. It was coming from the hallway right behind us. Lily whispered, "I'm going to check. Maybe someone left the back door open and it's just the wind." She tried to sound calm, but I could see her hands shaking. She slowly tiptoed toward the back door, checking the lock. It was locked, just like it had been all night. But as she turned back to us, she stopped dead in her tracks, her face draining of color. "What?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide as she looked past us. "There's someone in the hallway," she mouthed. Ava whipped her head around, and sure enough, we all saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the dark, just out of sight in the hallway. We couldn't make out his face, but we could see his outline clearly. A tall man, standing completely still, watching us. Panic hit me like a wave. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. None of us moved, none of us dared to make a sound. The man took a slow, deliberate step forward, and that's when I saw it. He was holding something, like a knife, gleaming faintly in the light coming from the kitchen. Ava gasped, and the sound seemed to jolt all of us into action. We sprang to our feet, racing toward the staircase. I don't think I'd ever moved so fast in my life. We dashed upstairs, nearly tripping over each other as we scrambled into Lily's bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us. Outside the door, we could hear the man's slow footsteps moving up the stairs. Each step creaked, each one sounding closer and closer. We held our breath, terrified he would hear us. He paused outside Lily's door, and the silence felt like it stretched on forever. Then we heard the doorknob jiggle. The man tried to open it once, twice. Then he started banging on it, hard, like he was trying to break it down. The thin wood of the door shuddered with each impact, and I was sure it wouldn't hold. My heart was pounding so loud, I thought he might hear it through the door. We huddled together, praying the police would get there soon. The banging continued, getting louder, more desperate. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Everything went silent. We didn't dare to move, listening, our ears straining to catch any sound. Then, from the other side of the door, we heard his voice. "I know you're in there," he said softly, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Come on, just open the door." I felt my stomach drop. He sounded too calm, too in control, like he enjoyed the fact that we were trapped and terrified. We stayed silent, pressing ourselves as far back into the room as we could, hoping he'd give up and leave. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, we heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder. I could have cried with relief. We heard footsteps racing down the stairs, and then the sound of the front door slamming shut. We stayed huddled in the room, too scared to open the door, until we heard the police knocking and calling out from downstairs. When we finally crept out of the bedroom, our legs shaky, we found 2 officers in the living room, flashlights in hand. They searched the house but found no sign of the man. He'd disappeared into the night. One of the officers told us we'd done the right thing by hiding and calling for help. He tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just a break-in gone wrong, that the man had probably expected the house to be empty. But there was something he didn't see, something only we noticed after the police left. On the hallway wall, near the staircase, there was a message scratched into the paint, written with something sharp. "See you soon." None of us slept that night, and I don't think any of us have ever felt truly safe since. Every time I'm alone, I can't help but wonder if he really will be back someday, just waiting for another chance. Jake invited us to sleep over at his house. His family had moved in just a few months ago, and he'd finally convinced his parents to let him throw a sleepover to show off his new old house. His parents were spending the weekend in the city, so it was just us 4, me, Jake, Liam, and Ben. Jake's house was huge, and honestly, a little creepy. It was one of those old Victorians with creaky floors, winding hallways, and of course, a dark, dusty attic. Jake had already warned us that the attic was off limits. It was packed with old junk from the previous owners and full of cobwebs and dead bugs, his words. None of us had any plans to go up there anyway. Around 10, we set up our sleeping bags in the living room, planning to binge horror movies all night. After watching a couple of classics and getting through half a bag of marshmallows, we were having a blast, and any creepy vibes from the house had all but faded. That was, until we heard the first sound. It was a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged across a rough floor. We all froze listening. "What was that?" Ben asked, his eyes wide. We all sat up, straining to hear, but the house was silent again. We laughed it off, trying to ignore the unease that had settled over us. "It's probably just the pipes," Jake shrugged, though his voice had a slight tremor. Old house and all. We resumed our movie marathon, but about half an hour later, we heard it again. This time, the sound was louder, like footsteps, shuffling slowly across a dusty floor above us. I glanced at Jake. "Are you sure no one else is here?" Jake shook his head, looking genuinely puzzled. "It's just us. My parents aren't back until Sunday." We tried to ignore it, convincing ourselves it was just the house settling. But as the night went on, the sounds got more frequent, soft bangs, shuffling, and every once in a while, a faint tapping, like something tapping rhythmically against the attic floor. "Maybe there's something up there," Liam said, half joking. "Like a raccoon?" Jake rolled his eyes. "I doubt a raccoon would be that loud. Plus, the attic's locked. My dad keeps the key in his office." But despite his words, I could tell he was uneasy. We were all getting pretty freaked out by now, and it was getting hard to concentrate on the movie with all the noises above us. Around 2 in the morning, then finally suggested that we go up and check out the attic, just to prove to ourselves it was empty so we could all relax. Reluctantly, Jake agreed, but he was visibly nervous. He led us down the hallway to his dad's office to get the key. The house felt colder as we walked, and every creak of the floor made us jump. When we reached his dad's office, Jake dug around in the drawer until he found a large brass key. "I can't believe we're doing this," he muttered as we made our way toward the attic stairs. The attic door was at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor. As we reached it, we stood there for a moment, none of us wanting to be the first to go in. Jake finally took a deep breath, slid the key into the lock, and twisted. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase leading up into pitch-black darkness. "Great. Who wants to go first?" Liam whispered, only half joking. Jake flicked on the light switch, and a dim flickering bulb at the top of the stairs cast eerie shadows across the walls. Holding our phone flashlights out in front of us, we crept up the stairs, one by one. The attic was cold, and the air felt heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in ages. Dust covered everything: old furniture, cardboard boxes, strange, covered shapes. Jake led us to the center of the room where we could finally see the floor clearly, and that's when we noticed it. There were footprints in the dust, not animal prints. Human footprints. They were small, almost like a child's, and they led from the far corner of the attic right to where we were standing. We all froze, staring at each other. "No way?" Liam whispered. Did someone come up here?" Jake shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with fear. "Nobody's been up here. My dad locked the door when we moved in." The footsteps didn't end where we were standing. They continued circling around us before stopping right next to the attic window. When we looked closer, we saw a smudged handprint on the glass, like someone had pressed their hand against it from the inside, looking out. As we stood there, trying to process what we were seeing, we heard a soft, shuffling sound coming from the corner of the attic, the same corner where the footprints had started. We turned our flashlights toward it, and for a moment, I was sure I saw a shadow moving, ducking behind a stack of boxes. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, barely able to keep the panic out of my voice. But as we turned to leave, we heard something that stopped us dead in our tracks, a quiet, almost childlike giggle, coming from somewhere in the attic. It was soft and faint, like someone was trying to hold it in but couldn't quite manage. We bolted for the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind us and locking it. None of us slept that night. We all huddled together in the living room, listening for any hint of movement upstairs. The attic was silent, but none of us could shake the feeling that we were being watched. In the morning, when Jake's parents came back, we told them everything. His dad went up to check the attic himself, but when he came down, he told us there was no sign of any footprints or handprints. The dust on the floor was completely undisturbed. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that faint giggle in my head, the sound of someone who was watching us, hiding just out of sight, waiting for us to come back.